So when I speak to youth pastors and church leaders and even Christian school teachers, I love to ask them questions about what they're teaching their youth in particular. And so the usual response when I ask them is, we teach theology or we teach the Bible. And that is actually the correct answer. That's a good answer. But I don't usually leave it there. I'm sometimes ask too many questions and sometimes get annoying with my questions. But I have a follow-up question. And that is, what are you teaching your youth about evolution? At which point I usually get a blank stare from the youth pastor or the church leader, and they're thinking, okay, that ain't my job, right? That's not my job. But when the church ignores a subject like we're going to look at, evolution, in our youth group meetings or our Sunday school classrooms, we do a huge disservice to our students. Many of our students are science-minded, okay? And they'll go off to university, and they will hear arguments for evolution that from brilliant evolutionists themselves. And when they hear an argument for evolution from an evolutionist for the first time, they'll have no defense against it, and that will almost certainly end in disaster. Now, I talked, when was it? In our opening session about the difference between isolating our youth and inoculating our youth. And I think this is one important area where we need to do that. We don't need to isolate our youth from things like evolution. We need to inoculate them with the truth, and the truth hopefully will lead them to rejecting something like this. And so let me start by just describing how our culture views the subject of evolution. Richard Dawkins, again, we mentioned him in a couple of the sessions. He's, again, one of the most famous atheists alive today. And listen to what he says about evolution. He says this: evolution is a fact. Beyond reasonable doubt, beyond serious doubt, beyond sane, informed, intelligent doubt, beyond doubt, evolution is a fact. The evidence for evolution is at least as strong as the evidence for the Holocaust. Yeah. And so if you're a creationist, you're like a Holocaust denier. Okay? In fact, if you read his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, which I have, he refers to creationists as deniers. Okay? And many people have read his book. There's another guy, a biologist at the University of Chicago. He wrote a book. At the same time Dawkins wrote his book, 2009. This was the celebration of Charles Darwin's birth. He was born in 1809. So it was the 200th anniversary in 2009 of his birth. And it was also the 150th anniversary of Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. So 2009 was a big year. And Jerry Coyne wrote this book called Why Evolution is True. And he says this in the opening pages. In fact, it's in the preface. He says, evolution is a fact, and far from casting doubt on Darwinism, the evidence gathered by scientists over the past century and a half support it completely. Now, I want to go back to Dawkins because he makes some really radical claims. And he actually said this in a book review. He said, it's absolutely safe to say, if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. And so, let me ask you a question. After reading that, who does not believe in evolution? And before you put your hand up, I want you to figure out which one of these are you, right? Do you want to be ignorant, stupid, insane, or wicked? Yeah, all of the above, please. No. How about none of the above? So this question, who does not believe in evolution? It's actually not a fair question. It's actually not a fair question. Because the word evolution has come to mean so many different things. There's actually a question that you should ask me. If I said, do you believe in evolution? You should ask me a question. In fact, if you get this book called Tactics, written by Greg Kokel, my boss, his first Columbo question. Do you guys know Columbo, Lieutenant Columbo? Yeah. You remember him? If you like Columbo, you're going to love his book. And I could go into a whole talk on tactics. But one of the questions, the Columbo questions, it's the first Columbo question he goes through in his book. And it's the question, what do you mean by that? If someone makes a statement or asks you a question, you may need some clarification. And so you may need to ask, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by evolution? Whenever someone asks me, do you believe in evolution? The first thing I say to that person or ask that person is, what do you mean by evolution? Because they might have an idea in their mind, like molecules to man evolution, or maybe they're just thinking about dogs changing, okay, or something like that. And so this is an important question. In fact, on some definitions of evolution, I am an evolutionist. On other definitions, I'm not an evolutionist. So we have to be very, very careful on how we define the term evolution. So for example, evolution can mean change over time. That's uncontroversial. Everyone agrees that living things change. No one denies that. It can mean change in gene frequency in a population. This happens every time two people have a baby. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of all that. But you get some of your genes from mom and some of your genes from dad, and I got the hair gene from my dad, sadly. And that's evolution. That's change in gene frequency. Third, evolution can mean the mechanism of natural selection acting on random mutation. And this is the mechanism that's supposed to give us all of the diversity of life. We'll talk more about that. Or it could even mean what's called limited common descent. What does that mean? Well, for example, all dogs go back to two dogs, something like a gray wolf. Everyone agrees on this point, okay? And this is explicitly what's taught in the Bible, by the way, limited common descent. All human beings go back to two human beings, limited common descent. And so on this view, the organisms on a particular tree are all related. Okay, but there's limits. There's limits. This is something that most evolutionists won't grant. So you don't have one kind of creature turn into another kind of creature. You might call this the creation orchard of life. Okay, as contrasted by the evolution tree of life. All of these things. If you got to just remember one term, think microevolution. Microevolution. That is small-scale evolution. This is uncontroversial. It's virtually accepted by everyone, okay? What about the controversial definitions of evolution? Well, you could argue that evolution is universal common descent. What does that mean? It means this, that all of life is related, all of life. And it all goes back 3.8 billion years ago to like a single-celled organism, okay? All of life. So my colleague, Brett Kunkel, he doesn't like that he's on there, but on this view, he's related to chimpanzees. There's a common ancestor between the two. And there's also a common ancestor between Brett Kunkel and a banana, okay? You just got to go back and find that particular node in the tree, okay? In that little where it comes together. So this is called universal common descent, just so you have your terminology straight. And then finally, some evolutionists take this idea of universal common descent and they say, well, that all took place solely through an unguided natural process of natural selection and random mutation. So that might be our sixth definition. What I would summarize that as macroevolution. So there's two categories. One that's uncontroversial. It's accepted by everyone. And the other is more controversial, and it is not accepted by everyone. Micro, macro. So keep those categories in your mind. This isn't something that creationists invented. In fact, I have university evolution textbooks that use the same terminology, micro and macro. Okay? And so this isn't something that creationists just came up with. So the evidence for evolution. We're going to look at all the evidence, particularly that's used to support macroevolution. Because I have no beef with micro, I think it happens all the time. I want to look specifically at what do our textbooks say about this idea of macro, universal common descent, something like that. Okay, I've actually taught biology in the high school, and so I'm familiar with the arguments that are in the textbook. So what I thought I'd do is take all those arguments and put them in a talk and just see if they really add up to all that evidence. So I've broken the evidence down, and as far as I know, I'm the only one who's ever done something like this. So you probably won't find this anywhere else. And so it may not be perfect, but here's how I've broken it up. I think the evidence can be put in these categories. And it's supposed to be, what do they call this? An alliteration, right? There's a lot of E's here. Exaggerated extrapolation, egregious errors. Yes, there are errors in the textbook, and even the scientific community will attest to that. And then finally, equivocal evidence. Equivocal evidence. So first, exaggerated extrapolation. This is probably the most common mistake made by evolutionists. It's a mistaken projection. It's a mistaken projection. That is, evolutionists take microevolution, and then they think, well, given enough time, add enough time, and you will get macroevolution. But all the examples of microevolution in the world do not equal macroevolution. These are two different things. And so, for example, they may point to finch beaks. We'll look at this in more detail in a second. And they will take minor change in the finch beak and extrapolate that to a dinosaur, and say a dinosaur could have evolved into a bird over millions of years. In fact, that's the reigning theory right now, is that these small dinosaurs actually evolved into birds. And so this is the extrapolation. So you take small scale change, beaks changing, because of a given environment, and well, if we just give it enough time, you'll have a reptile turning into a bird. The next category is going to be the egregious errors. Now, egregious just means appalling or terrible, and so I really think that there are terrible errors in the textbook that needs just to be taken out. This amounts to mistaken information, not a mistaken projection, it's mistaken information. They get the facts wrong, okay? These include evidence that has been shown to be false, and I'm going to show you that it's been shown, some that's been shown to be false, and evidence that's just outdated and has been overturned. And so if the theory of evolution is as established as evolutionists claim, remember, evolution is a fact, Richard Dawkins says. If that's true, then you don't need to use outdated arguments in the textbook, right? I mean, that just makes sense. And then finally, equivocal evidence. This is evidence that could be evidence for evolution, and I won't deny that. But it could equally be evidence for creation, okay? In fact, I'm going to show you some of the best evidence I think there is for evolution. But I think it's also equally good for creation. So this is a mistaken interpretation or maybe a mistaken conclusion. Okay, so I need to give you guys a little crash course because I'm sure some of you have been out of the biology classroom for a little while. So let's do a little bit of biology here, in particular genetics. I want to talk about natural selection and how that works. And so I want you to imagine two dogs. Now, on the screen you see that on their stomachs they have these two genes. These are actually called the alleles. One is for short hair and one's for long hair. And what I want to do is see what happens when these guys get married and have babies, right? Because they got to get married first. And so that's what I tell kids anyways. And so let's see what happens. Well, if you get a short-haired gene from mom and a short-haired gene from dad, well, you're going to end up with a dog with short fur, okay? Now, in this case, I'm actually using kind of what's called incomplete dominance, or it's a classical example that you find in pink snapdragons, where genes have a combining effect. Now, this actually I don't think happens with dogs. There's a dominant and recessive gene, but just for the sake of the argument, let's go with this. Long-haired gene from mom and a short-haired gene from dad, well, let's say those combine and you get medium-length fur, okay? And similarly, that can happen where just you get a different gene. You get the long hair from dad and the short hair from mom. I don't know if you noticed, but that's the same dog. I just put a pink bow on it. And then finally, a long-haired gene from mom and a long-haired gene from dad, and you get long hair, okay? Again. But I want to show you, I'm not really concerned with the genetics here, but more with natural selection. And so we're going to take those dogs and we're going to drop them off somewhere really cold. Like, let's take them to Antarctica or something, okay? Now what happens, it's really sad. I know you guys aren't going to like this. But the medium length fur and the short fur, they die. It's terrible. Nature selected them out. Now, they die, and now if this long-haired dude, if he can find himself a girlfriend, and things work out, and again they get married, you can see here that they'll survive and they're going to leave offspring into the next generation. And so here we have natural selection in action. You actually have nature selecting for different genes, different traits. But you'll notice here, at least in this example, the short hair, medium hair genes, or fur, maybe I should say, they've actually been selected out. I mean, this is what natural selection does. It selects things out. And then what you're left with is just the long-haired gene. But we've actually lost genetic information in this example. So this is our example of natural selection. Now keep this in the back of your mind. Notice natural selection selects, it doesn't create something new. That's important when we get to some of the examples that we're going to look at for our exaggerated extrapolation. And so if you look at a textbook, almost every textbook has this example here. It's the peppered moths. It's the peppered moths. And this is going to be really exciting because everybody loves moths, right? So peppered moths have been studied in detail for over 200 years. Before the Industrial Revolution in Europe, the vast majority of peppered moths were light-colored, okay? They had a light-colored wing pattern. And that effectively camouflaged them on light-colored trees. In fact, the lichen on the tree was light-colored, and so they were camouflaged. However, due to widespread pollution during the Industrial Revolution from coal factories, the lichen actually died on the trees, and the trees that the peppered moths would rest on actually became blackened by soot, okay, causing the dark ones to be camouflaged and the white ones to be exposed and easy prey to a bird. And so you actually get a population change. And then it turns out 30 years later, or in the last 30 years, because of all the pollution control that we put in place, well, the trees are actually, the lichen's growing back, the trees are getting lighter, and what we're actually seeing is the light-colored moss population growing again while the dark-colored moss is declining. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, this story has been shown, it's put forward as conclusive evidence for evolution. But I want you to notice some things that happened. First of all, we had moss to begin with. In fact, we had both variety. And all we've seen here is a population shift from light to dark back to light. And so nature has done a good job selecting. We have survival of the fittest here. But we do not have arrival of the fittest. And this is what macroevolution needs as evidence for that theory. Just so you're aware, even this story has come under quite a bit of scrutiny, okay? Whether they actually landed on the trees and not under the leaves, because when we actually study peppered moths today, we actually see they actually like to live under the leaves of the tree. And so even the story has come under some question, but granting its truth, let's just say it's true for the sake of argument, this is not the kind of thing that can be extrapolated to molecules into a man over millions of years. It just doesn't seem to be up to the task. How about this one? Finch beaks. Every high school textbook talks about finch beaks. They're often referred to as Darwin's finches, okay? And so we have these finches, at least 13 different variety today, that seem to all be related. And so when Charles Darwin was on the Galapagos Islands, he discovered these different varieties of finch. The most striking difference between these finches was the size of the beak and the shape of the beak. The beaks seem to be adaptive for what they're eating, okay? And so a narrow, sharp beak was often good for getting into fruit. A large, tough beak was good for getting into nuts. And what they actually found was when there was periods of drought, the beaks would actually, on average, grow as a result. And that's because you need a big beak to get through these nuts in a drought. And so, again, here we have a good example of nature selecting, maybe microevolution, but it is an incredible extrapolation to go from changing finch beaks to, 100 million years from now getting a completely different organism, like a reptile into a bird, that kind of thing, okay? And so here is a great example of natural selection, but it doesn't count as macroevolution. Why? Because macroevolution is a different category. Remember, we went through our definitions. Macroevolution needs its own evidence, and it just doesn't provide that. So here we've seen examples of natural selection. It's a selecting force, but it's not creative. It just selects from what already exists, okay? Now, how do you get evolution? Well, you don't just have natural selection. You have to add mutations. If you want to evolve something, you need to mutate, okay? And so I was on the University of Berkeley website. It has a website devoted to understanding evolution. It's actually called Understanding Evolution. And the site says this is really important for our study here. It says mutations are essential to evolution. They are the raw material of genetic variation. Without mutation, evolution could not occur. So you need mutations. They are a must if you want to produce new organisms. So the problem with mutations is that they're almost always harmful. Almost always. In fact, there was a gentleman here for the first session, and he's got a PhD in it was either biogenetics or biochemistry, and he's actually doing his second postdoc, which is wild. But he made the same, we talked about evolution, he said, yeah, in his research as well, almost all mutations are harmful. You don't want a mutation. You don't want one. Despite, watching X-Men and all these really cool superhero things, where it looks like a mutation gives you powers, you don't want one. However, mutations can be beneficial. They can actually help an organism survive. And so the classic example that is in most textbooks is antibiotic-resistant bacteria, okay? And so this is going to be our third icon. Let's look at it together. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria is claimed to be evolution before our very eyes. You creationists want evidence? Just look. Now, let's pretend that you have a stomach ulcer, okay? Let's pretend you have a stomach ulcer. And it's caused by this guy. It's called H. pylori or Helicobacter pylori. It's a nasty bacteria. You don't want it. To kill this guy, you go to the doctor, and he gives you an antibiotic, okay? And which normally kills the bacteria, normally kills this guy. However, in your case, some of the bacteria, some of your H. pylori, actually have evolved the ability to survive. The antibiotic won't work on them. See? Proof for evolution. Evolution before our eyes. But let me show you what's really going on, at least in this case. And there are many examples that we could go through, but here's just one. So let's say you have H. pylori in your stomach causing this ulcer. And what happens is scientists very cleverly have devised an antibiotic. The antibiotic itself is not the poison. What happens is the antibiotic mixes with something the bacteria already has. In fact, it's an enzyme that's produced by the organism. In here, it's orange or yellow, okay? When those mix together, they produce a poison. They produce the poison. It's assisted suicide. Assisted suicide. So you could see how when they combine, it could produce a poison. Now, wait a second. Remember, we have our mutant H. pylori. This guy's mutated. He can survive. But how he survives is that he actually broke something inside of him. This bacteria, you know that enzyme? That enzyme that he produces? Well, he doesn't produce it anymore. So he got a mutation that doesn't cause him, he lacks that ability. And so remember, the antibiotic, that's not a poison in itself. It has to mix with the enzyme. And so therefore, this guy survives. But notice how he survived. You broke something that the bacteria already had. This is not the kind of, you can't extrapolate, well, if you just keep breaking stuff, then you're eventually going to get this new, better organism. It doesn't work like that. You can't just break things and get where evolution needs to go, okay? And so even this seems to be the wrong approach. So in our first example, this extrapolation, this exaggerated extrapolation, when we look at finch beaks, when we look at peppered moths, and when we look at antibiotic-resistant bacteria, just adding time to the mix, no matter how much time, will never equal macroevolution. It's just not there. This is just not an extrapolation. Remember, this is the best evidence. This is from the textbooks. How about this one? Egregious errors. Egregious errors. I think I got 2 or 3 here. So these should be literally ripped out of the textbook. When I taught this material in grade 11 biology, I wanted to just tear the pages out of the book. But let me go through some of those with you. How many of you have heard of transitional forms? You know, that kind of idea. Sometimes we call them missing links, right? Missing links. Well, we're told that there are all of these transitional forms or missing links in the fossil record that prove conclusively that certain organisms have evolved. So, for example, whale evolution, that's a classic example. Something like a dog that they call Pakicetus evolved over about 10 million years into a fully aquatic whale. Likewise, fish into a tetrapod, something that walked on land. These are examples, but let's look a little bit more closely in this. So we're told that if you examine the fossil record, you will see creatures evolving slowly over time. For instance, evolutionists will assert that dinosaurs evolved into birds. This is a remarkable claim that I think requires a lot of evidence to back it up. If this is true, we should find an enormous amount of number of fossils in the fossil record, slowly becoming from a reptile, like a dinosaur, into a bird, okay? Now listen, when you start out in the fossil record, lower in the fossil record, you should see examples of maybe 90% dinosaur, 10% bird, and then 80% dinosaur, 20% bird. Slowly, remember, this is how evolution works, slow and gradual, until you get somewhere in the middle, and they like to point to something like Archaeopteryx, which they think is kind of one of these transitional forms, until all of a sudden you get something closer to a bird, and then now we have fully formed birds. This is how it works, okay? This is how it's supposed to work. Now, I could go into more and more detail about something like Archaeopteryx. I think Archaeopteryx is a fully formed bird. It's a little weird bird. It has teeth, and no living bird alive today has teeth. It has this bony tail structure, not the kind that you'd see like wagging, but it had feathers on it. It's a weird bird, but I think it's a bird nonetheless. Now, what we notice is there should be millions of these creatures in the fossil record, and we hardly find any. Archaeopteryx is one of the main guys that are in the textbook. They're called missing links for a reason, because they're missing links, okay? And so a guy like Charles Darwin, he said they were missing back in his day, and I think they're still missing even today, but this is what he said. In 1859, The Origin of Species, this is where it all got going, okay? He said the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the earth must be truly enormous, must be enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal such a finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection that can be urged against my theory. That's in his own book. I think actually Charles Darwin was very open-minded when it came to this, at least falsifying his own theory. You try and bring this stuff up today, and they'll come after you. And so here we are today, 150 years later. And this gentleman, Stephen Jay Gould, he's not a Christian. He's an atheist, or was an atheist. He's passed away. He was a Harvard paleontologist. So he's one of these smart guys, but he recognized the problem, okay? He said this: the extreme rarity of transitional forms, the missing links, in the fossil record, listen, persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks, and they're in every textbook, have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. It's not that we have all these fossils, it's an inference that he thinks is reasonable. I don't think it is. And so this problem bothered Gould a lot, and actually many other paleontologists. So he actually came to reject the idea that evolution is slow and gradual, often called gradualism. Richard Dawkins, he's a gradualist. Charles Darwin, he's a gradualist. Stephen Jay Gould, who's a paleontologist, said, no, there's no evidence for gradualism. He said, no, there's something else that must be going on. And he called it punctuated equilibrium. What's that? Have you guys heard of punctuated equilibrium? Okay, so this is, and it's mentioned in the textbook kind of as a side note. But these guys came up with this idea because they saw no evidence. What you find is stasis in the fossil record. The same organisms look the same no matter where you go, and then boom, there's a jump to a new creature. So evolution is not slow and gradual. It's so fast, the fossil record couldn't even catch it. You see how this is a problem? Because it doesn't really matter what the evidence says. There's no evidence for slow and gradual evolution, so let's come up with a new theory, like punctuated equilibrium, rather than considering something else, like maybe creation. I think actually they're both right. I think Richard Dawkins is right that punctuated equilibrium is wrong, and I think Stephen Jay Gould is right that slow and gradual is wrong. Okay? They're both wrong. So let's just give one example. So I mentioned in the textbook they talk about fish evolving into land animals that walked on land. This all happened supposedly between 385 million years ago and then 365. So in 20 million years, fish climbed out and started walking around. So you went from Euthanopteron and Pandicteres, Panderichthys, that's right, Ichthyostega and Acanthosaga, okay? These are the creatures that they talk about. And lo and behold, wouldn't it be awesome if they found a transitional form right there? That would just be, I mean, this would be the evolutionist dream come true. And sure enough, in 2004, there was a Tiktaalik discovered in actually Canada. It was discovered in Nunavut, okay? So this guy is like our pride and joy. Now here's the problem, because you'll find most textbooks will talk about Tiktaalik or Tiktaalik. Here's the problem though. The problem with all this is that we've actually discovered fossil footprints that are older than the supposed transitional form. In 2010, there were fossil footprints discovered in Poland that date back, whether you agree with the dates or not, but these are older. They date older than Tiktaalik. And they're actually of a 4-footed creature. You can see them here, probably something 8 feet long, and the feet are actually 10 inches across. This was a big land creature. Now, you don't need a PhD in biology to know that your transitional form can't come after. It has to come in the middle, right? It has to be in between. That's what makes it a transition. And so Tiktaalik cannot be a transitional form. It's getting kicked out of there because we have something walking around before all of this. And this is something that the textbooks just won't tell you. So Tiktaalik gets the cart before the horse, okay? It's not a transitional form. And so I think it needs to be, especially Tiktaalik, should be torn out of the book. Now, embryology, this is the worst. This is absolutely the worst evidence possible for evolution. It's an argument from embryology. It looks like this. And it's iconic because Darwin said this was the strongest argument for his theory. He said this in a letter to Asa Gray, who was one of his friends, who was an American botanist. And he said this: "It is curious how each one, I suppose, weighs arguments in a different balance. Embryology is, to me, by far the strongest single class of evidence in favor of change of form. And not one, I think, of my reviewers has alluded to this." So he was being critiqued by different people. And he said, no, this is the strongest evidence. And you guys can't say anything about it because it's so good. Problem is, this idea of embryology, it's a total fraud. Let me explain. This is our fifth icon. In the late 1800s, a German biologist named Ernst Haeckel, he drew a series of diagrams, embryos, that had, for different animals. So he drew a human, a chicken, a salamander, a fish. And these embryos showed such similarity in their earliest stages, and he took this as confirming evidence that, look at that. Just as they are all similar and then diverge, similarly, this shows that all animals really go back to a common ancestor. So as any organism develops, whether you're a human or a fish or whatever, we all kind of recapitulate our evolutionary history, okay? And so there's a fish stage. You can see there's your gill slits. There's your tail. Let me just say a brief thing about some of those. So gill slits. You guys can all make your own gill slits. Here's how you do it. Just put your chin like this, and you'll create gill slits, okay? It turns out those are just folds of skin, and most of us can make them, okay? They're just folds of skin. They have nothing to do with respiration. Nothing to do with that. Tail, is that really a tail? Well, it turns out the embryo has to end somewhere, doesn't it? And so wherever there's an ending point, I mean, have you ever tried this? Take a rope and then try and get rid of the end by cutting it off. It just won't work, okay? You'll be there a long time. So it turns out that tail, that part that ends, actually comes up on the small of your back. You don't have a tail. But what's the biggest problem with this idea? Well, here's an actual photograph of the embryos themselves. The problem is that the embryo drawings that Ernst Haeckel put in the textbooks, that we have in our textbooks, are fraudulent, okay? Can you all see the difference? I hope you can. They're not what he drew. They're not what he drew. In fact, this is not creationists crying about this stuff. This was in the journal Science, okay? In fact, they had a short piece on Haeckel's embryos. This is what they said. They said, it looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology. That's a screenshot of the actual article in the journal Science. And yet, you take a 2015 textbook, you will see that exact image, okay? Let me ask you something. If your theory is just so good, it's a fact, why would you continue to put this in a textbook? Don't you think that misleads a little bit? Why not put the actual photograph? I mean, we have the technology to photograph embryos. They won't do that, though, because they know that the photographs don't deceive people like these images do. Okay, how about this? So that's 2 egregious errors. Here's the last one, and it's, I think, equally egregious. It's called junk DNA. What I want to do is I'm actually going to show you a quick clip.
I got some junk in my trunk, or in my DNA, or both. Hey guys, it's Trace again for D News. Our DNA might be mostly nothing. Yep, nada, zip, just trash. Scientists learned in the 80s that of all DNA, maybe 2% contains actual genes. Genes are the switches that turn on the production of proteins that make us who, how, and what we are. The rest of that 98%, we're not sure what that does. If anything, it might just be junk DNA, or what the scientists call non-coding DNA. Since its discovery, scientists have found that this disorganized and mostly mysterious section of our genetic code doesn't really seem to do anything. So why don't we just cut it out? Because we're not entirely sure that it's useless. That's why it just seems to be. The scientists see it as just junk, waste. Humans are more like the lily. We've got something like 500 billion base pairs, with 98% of that being non-coding DNA or junk DNA. Why do we have it? No idea. Not even close. What do you think of this study? Do you think our DNA is full of junk, of years of trial and error of evolution, or are we missing the bigger picture?
I think he's missing the bigger picture. Let me try and explain that to you. So almost every textbook includes junk DNA as evidence for evolution. In fact, this was used by a well-known Christian. His name's Francis Collins. And he's a theistic evolutionist and wrote a book called The Language of God, which I think is a good book, except for the part where he talks about evolution. And he was the head of the Human Genome Project. He's a smart guy. But he used junk DNA as an argument for, God would never put all that junk in our DNA. So he wrote this a number of years ago. And so this was his argument against God creating and more the evolutionary process, doing all the work for God, and that's why there's all this junk. And so it's true, part of our DNA, only about 2% codes for protein. The other 98% they thought was, they called it junk DNA. It doesn't code for proteins. They thought it didn't do anything. Just leftovers, just accumulated stuff, over our evolutionary history, gets kicked out of the section where we keep the junk. That was until 2012, when there was something called the ENCODE project. You probably heard of the Human Genome Project, where they mapped out our entire human genome Well, it turns out they kept going, and there was something called the ENCODE project where they're studying more of the DNA. And here's what they found. This is in the abstract. They say that this part of the DNA, they assigns biochemical function to 80% of the genome, in particular outside the well-studied protein coding region. What are they saying? That part that they thought was junk, at least 80%, this is back in 2012, at least 80% is functional. It doesn't code for proteins, but it's doing something. It's regulating certain things. It's like switches, turning things on and off. You need the so-called junk. And so it looks like even that is like a software program that helps build certain structures in the cell. Okay, so junk DNA, embryology, and the transitional forms, I think that should go. I don't think the evidence is adequate there. I think it's actually mostly false. And so finally, let's look at this, equivocal evidence. There's just two points here. Equivocal evidence, that means it's open to more than one interpretation. So this is a category of evidence for evolution that could be interpreted another way. Evolutionists love to point to vestigial organs, that is, functionless structures in the biological realm, okay? This, again, is in almost all the textbooks. Something they'll point to that's no longer functional, and they say, see, God would never do that. They might point to the coccyx, it's a bone. They say that used to be where our tail, we used to swing on trees, and so that's a leftover there. But that's useless. You don't need your coccyx. Well, except for the fact that if you were judging a bone by the number of muscles that are attached to it, the coccyx would win. Your tailbone would win. It has more muscles that join to it than any other bone in your body. How about the whale? It's got those leftover legs. Your appendix, that's useless. Just get rid of it, right? It's pointless. Here's probably the most common, and this is they point to vestigial eyes. Richard Dawkins, in his book The Greatest Show on Earth, he says this: vestigial eyes are evidence of evolution. Given that a cave salamander lives in perpetual darkness, so has no use for eyes, why would a divine creator nevertheless furnish it with dummy eyes, clearly related to eyes, but non-functional? That seems like a really stupid thing to do for a creator, to put in these non-functional eyes, just dummy eyes. Well, this is almost a laughable argument. What do we say to Dawkins? Well, vestigial structures are entirely consistent with an intelligent designer. These could have been structures that were initially designed, but then lost their function through natural selection and mutation. Everyone agrees that the structures started out functional, but they lost their function. They became non-functional. This isn't evolution. This is de-evolution. Okay? What evolutionists need to show is how you get the eyes in the first place. That's what I want to see, not how you break eyes. This is just so obvious. How many of us have owned at one time a junk car, right? Most of us. I know my first car, I don't think the AC worked. Now listen, if the AC doesn't work, does that mean my car was never designed by an intelligent designer? No. We know the intelligent designer made the car with the AC that worked. And over time, let's call it natural selection, it broke. But we can't conclude, it would be ridiculous to conclude that therefore there was no designer in the first place. In the same way, there are these cave salamanders and cave fish that have lost their pigment. They have lost their ability to see. But that's not evolution. That's not the kind of process that's going to take you from a single cell to a human over millions of years. That's just breaking stuff again, okay? Again, it helps the organism survive, doesn't need eyes, but again, this is not the kind of thing. It's equivocal. I think it's evidence that points just as equally to an intelligent designer. How about this one? I saved the best for last. This is called homology. I think homology really is one of the strongest evidences ever put forward by evolution. Homology has to do with similarities between organisms, okay? Evolutionists understand this similarity to be from a common descent. That is, they came from a common ancestor. So for example, the human arm, the cat leg, the whale flipper, the bat wing. These all have a similar pattern. Their forelimb is actually quite similar. Each of them starts with quite a large bone, and then that's connected to two smaller bones, and then you have even smaller bones in the what we would have as a hand. And so this is like a 5, they call it a pentadactyl pattern. We just call them fingers. And so this is evidence for common descent or common ancestor. But listen, it could equally be evidence of a common designer. Let me show you. I want to use an illustration to answer this, to look at this. I want you to look at the iPods on the screen. Did you guys know there were so many iPods? And there's one iPad there. Now, there is much similarity between these devices, isn't there? What best explains the similarity? Well, here we go. How about we draw a little tree? Maybe one evolved into the next over a long period of time. How about some evolved bigger screens, while others completely lost their screen? The shuffle became vestigial, maybe. Maybe some evolved color screens, and still others evolved a touch screen, right? And then maybe even through punctuated equilibrium, we get the iPad, right? There's a jump. Or maybe, just maybe, the best explanation is not common descent, but it's common design. Maybe the similarity in these devices that they share is due to the fact that there's a common designer that created all of them. And of course, I mean, we all know that's actually what happened. This is the common designer is Apple. And so when we look at a whale flipper and we look at a bat wing, there's similarity. No one can deny the similarity. The question is, what's the best explanation? It doesn't have to be common descent. It could equally be common design. It could be equally. Actually, I don't think it's a coin flip. I think the answer is better that it's a common designer. Here's why. If you look at something like the eye of a whale and the eye of a human and the eye of a mouse, because we are all mammals, well, we would say that what they would say is those all go back to a common ancestor. That's common descent. That's what they would argue. But here's the problem with this idea. The octopus also has an eye, and it is strikingly similar to the vertebrate eye of the whale, the human, and the mouse. But no evolutionist believes that these three creatures share a common ancestor with a similar eye with the octopus, okay? Well, they think we have a common ancestor, but they didn't get an eye from a common ancestor. In fact, this is remarkable. Not only did the animal kingdom evolve the eye once, it actually evolved independently more than once. The octopus evolved an eye at the same time, but completely independent, in a completely different environment. They call this, by the way, when we find something that doesn't make sense of homology, like this, they call it convergent evolution. What I would call this, though, is this is a common designer. And he's able to put an eye in insects. He's able to put an eye in vertebrates. He's able to put an eye in an octopus. And they all share a similar pattern, absolutely. But I think it is best explained by a common designer. Or else you have to believe things like the eyeball, which are just incredibly complex, and then connected to the nervous system and everything else, that this evolved not just once, but multiple times. That flight, you think flight is pretty cool. Birds do it, bats do it. You have all these different creatures, and it all evolved independently. Echolocation evolved independently in different organisms. This is something that I think the evidence points more towards a common designer than a common ancestor. So here's a question that I want to leave you with. If there aren't any good scientific arguments for evolution, and I just went through 8. There are more icons of evolution, but I just went through 8. Why is evolution so widely believed? Why is it so widely believed? Well, because in some sense it's true. things change all the time, right? Things change all the time. Natural selection happens. Moths and finch and bacteria, they all change. So in one sense, when someone says evolution's a fact, maybe they're thinking about that. And maybe they're confusing our distinction that we made right at the beginning. So they say, oh yeah, I'm an evolutionist, I believe in evolution, but really they're thinking about micro. But why is macroevolution so widely believed? Now, I don't believe it's for scientific reasons. I think primarily it's for philosophical reasons and even theological reasons. More specifically, it's believed because there's a commitment, and we've talked about this previously, there's a commitment to naturalism. Evolution is the only game in town, isn't it? So naturalism simply means that, we talked about this, that scientists must assume that only natural causes exist when they're doing their science. And so even before looking at the evidence, they have to exclude the possibility of a creator. And so when we see creation and evolution, we have the diversity of life. How do we make sense of this? For the naturalists, they say, oh, that's easy. There's only one explanation. It must be evolution. That's all we have. It really is. But listen, that's not where we can come from, because we don't have that same bias. We don't have that same presupposition that they're coming to. We can actually follow the evidence where it leads. And so looking at the evidence for evolution just from the science itself, I didn't quote any Bible verses, I'm just looking at the evidence. And this is supposedly the best that's offered. I mean, it's what's in the textbooks. It's what's supposed to persuade our students. It's what the title says, evidence for evolution, in that section, in that unit. And this is it. And so the evidence, I think, points away, the scientific evidence points away from macroevolution and towards supernatural intelligence. And if it does that, then I would say so be it. Let's be rational. Let's follow the evidence where it leads.